Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Following U.S. President Donald Trump's tweets warning Ankara about large sanctions over the arrest of American pastor Andrew Brunson, Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said that Turkey will never tolerate threats from anybody.
Andrew Brunson, an American pastor being tried on terrorism and spying charges in Izmir, was released after a court ruled on Wednesday to move him from prison to house arrest due to his health problems. Brunson, who has lived in Turkey for more than 2 decades, was indicted on charges of having links with the PKK and FETÖ, which Ankara blames for the failed coup in 2016. The second high panel court in Izmir had rejected Brunson's demand for release on July 18th, deciding to continue listening to the testimonies of witnesses in the next hearing, scheduled for October the 12th. Following an objection from Brunson's attorney, however, the same court ruled on July 25th to move Brunson from prison to house arrest, citing the health excuse that was highlighted in the plea. The court also banned Brunson from leaving Turkey and imposed a judicial control decision. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo welcomed the ruling, but added that it's not enough. We welcome long overdue news that Pastor Brunson has been moved from prison to house arrest in Turkey, but it's not enough. We have seen no credible evidence against Mr. Brunson and call on Turkish authorities to resolve his case immediately in a transparent and fair manner, Pompeo said in a tweet on July 25th. Brunson was detained nearly 2 years ago and faces up to 35 years in prison if found guilty. He denied the charges, calling them shameful and disgusting. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence said in a series of tweets yesterday that they would impose sanctions on Turkey unless Brunson is free. To President Erdogan and Turkish authorities, I have a message. On behalf of the President of the United States of America, release Pastor Andrew Brunson now or be prepared to face the consequences. If Turkey does not take immediate action to free this innocent man of faith and send him to America, the United States will impose significant sanctions on Turkey until Pastor Andrew Brunson is free, Pence said in 2 consecutive tweets. Shortly afterwards, President Trump confirmed in a tweet what Pence announced on his behalf, saying, "The United States will impose large sanctions on Turkey for the long-time detainment of Pastor Andrew Brunson. He is suffering greatly. This innocent man of faith should be released immediately," Trump added, describing him as a great Christian, family man and wonderful human being. Turkey, on the other hand, did not welcome the warnings of Trump and Pence, calling them as threats. "No one dictates Turkey. We will never tolerate threats from anybody. Rule of law is for everyone, no exception," Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu said in a tweet. Likewise, presidential spokesperson Ibrahim Kalın said, "Threatening language is unacceptable," while calling on the US to adopt a constructive position.
Tonight, we're joined by Şebnem Arsu, who is a former New York Times reporter and a journalist based in Istanbul, and will focus on the current state of U.S.-Turkey relations in light of the case of the American pastor Andrew Brunson. Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, U.S. President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence made some exceptionally harsh remarks over the Brunson case yesterday, and they hinted at some possible sanctions against Turkey. And what has ensued seems like an unprecedented crisis. But I'd like to start by asking you, in your opinion, what kind of a crisis is this? How serious is this for the future of Turkey-U.S. relations?
Well, it is serious. It is impossible not to call it not serious because we have the heads of states on both sides, Trump on one hand, his Vice President Pence, and Erdogan, his spokesperson, his deputy, and the foreign minister all engaged in one conversation quite publicly over social media, which is quite unorthodox when you think about the size and magnitude of the relations. So yes, it is serious, but when you look at the recent phase in relations, it has not been excellent, and suddenly it's not a sudden fall. There has been a gradual deterioration in relations since 2016, and we've lived through a visa suspension by the US that was mimicked by the Turkish side. And then there is the continuing arrests of US nationals in Turkey on terror charges. Some of them are Turkish. We have 2 consulate workers still in jail on terror charges. And on the other hand, on the military front, there is this really thorny and controversial issue on whether Turkey should still go ahead purchasing Russian anti-missile defense system S-400s and risk the security environment in NATO or not. And there is the purchase of F-35, the warplanes that Turkey has been willing to purchase from the United States, as partially also manufactures them too, that the Congress has strictly, basically orchestrated this concentrated effort for them not to end up in Turkish hands. So when you line up these issues, I mean, whether that row of words had been, used on social media or not, the bilateral relations is not at its peak. So yes, it is a serious crisis still.
And how do you evaluate Turkey's response to this crisis, so to speak, and to the comments made by Trump and Pence yesterday? How was this response received in Washington?
I think the statements by the Turkish officials were understandable because when Trump's let's say salvo or the words that he used on social media cannot be accepted on in a sense of proper political rhetoric. So yes, it had to be responded in some way, but on the other hand, you have these exchanges, yet you know that on both sides, parties do rely on each other and do depend on each other in many ways, especially militarily speaking. In Syria, there is a continuing patrolling mission in Manbij, and there is that joint effort, and that's why after all these statements, no matter how harsh the words had been, you've seen the Pentagon officials stepping in and saying, no, our relations are going on its regular pace. That means something. And neither Turkey nor US want to compromise on this relative calm in Syria. They want to proceed because Syria is an important issue in Syria, in the US, as well as much as it is in Turkey. So they have to stick together on that front. Everybody knows that, and Pentagon official made it clear. What is interesting, in all these exchanges, we have to remember that the starting of this crisis with Andrew Brunson, it was President Erdogan back in, if I'm not mistaken, in September 2016, he opened the Pandora's box saying, you hand in our imam and we hand in your pastor. And at that point, the issue was dragged into political court. If it had remained in legal premises, it might have been dealt differently today. But the fact that the Brunson's arrest and the condition upon which his arrest would continue were directly tied to another completely separate case in the US had murred the waters.
And under these dire circumstances, what, in your opinion, should we expect from Turkey-US relations in the coming period and in the near future, perhaps?
Well, when I was in Washington last before general elections, talking to people, I realized that the continuing arrests of US nationals or Turkish nationals that have worked in the US consulates, their continuing arrest was a very big issue. Brunson was a very big issue. And back then, I tried to explain as much as I could that the issue was seen quite trivial in Turkey, whereas it spoke to a constituency in the US. So unless those arrests and those legal cases are dealt with, I do not see a complete peace accord signed between two countries. Also, S-400s. We're talking about Turkey getting closer to Russia. And right now, as one of the US political analysts told me, he said that Russia these days was worse than it was perceived during the Cold War times. So right now, US takes Russia and anything that is around it extremely seriously, and Turkey unfortunately falls into that category by purchasing S-400s and making them sit together with, for example, F-35s, which is an American-made plane, under the same roof. For many American politicians, from conservatives or Democrats, it doesn't matter. It is a compromise on their security, and it's a compromise on NATO's security. So in that respect, Turkey should decide whether it should go ahead with Patriot missiles, anti-defense system that US is offering to Turkey, or work together with Russia on S-400s. I think that is one of the critical issues that needs to be sorted out before the future of the relations actually sit on a proper track again.
We'll definitely get to Turkey's relations with Russia and how it may have an impact on its relations with the US. But before we do that, let's focus on the issue of the F-35 fighter jets now. The Congress negotiators agreed on a deal to block the delivery of these fighter jets to Turkey. And one of the justifications for this, actually two of the justifications for the decision were cited as the continued detention of Pastor Brunson, as well as security concerns related to Turkey's purchase of the S-400, of the Russian-made S-400 air missile defense systems, both of which you've referred to previously. So my question to you is, what's going on here, in your opinion, in this kind of a tit-for-tat situation? How realistic are these moves?
Well, it's very realistic. The congressman, Tillerson, Shaheen, Langford, these are the people that take the Brunson case extremely seriously, and the continuing arrest of other US nationals very, very seriously. And they made a very strong statement at Congress by adding certain phrases to a big spending bill that would end up Turkey's it will end up those F-35s not end in Turkey's hands. And they're going to proceed. And even further, I mean, when Trump talks about, we're planning big sanctions on Turkey, of course, he doesn't go into detail. He never goes into detail when he makes such statements. But when we talk about the sanction regime, not on the country entirely, but on individuals, there are many alternatives that the congressmen are working on. One is the stop of the sales of F-35s, and while doing so, they also had a phrase added to the bill that the president, in I think October and November 2019, will be obliged to name certain Turkish nationals to be put under visa restriction. Which means that those visa restrictions would eventually become a restriction of the Treasury, which means that their properties or assets in the US could be confiscated as well. So by 2019, if those arrests are not resolved, then according to this phrase added to the big bill that the president has to sign, he also has to name certain Turkish officials or nationals to be listed in this visa restriction. So that's one. And for example, CAATSA, the regulation that obliges countries that are trading with Russian defense sector to be sanctioned, will also apply to Turkey. I mean, there are currently countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia that has defense relations with Russia, but US uses waivers for them. I'm not sure whether US would, use a waiver for Turkey in the end of the day, if those issues are not resolved, like S-400s or, or the arrests or, other issues that might come. So unless they're resolved, cut is a serious possibility. And the other sanctions regime that people were talking about when I was there was the Global Magnitsky Act, which applies to officials that commit serious human rights violations. So and they were talking about certain names that are involved in the Brunson case to be considered within that category and be named for individual sanctions. So these are real. Mm-hmm. These are real. It's not a joke, as we've seen with F-35s. There has been a big ceremony held in the US, and the pro-government media tried to portray it as, the Congress has failed. We now have the planes, but that's not true. It was like, many people say that it was just a test drive, but the planes are in the US. They're not leaving the US, and it will take some time and political decision for the planes to actually arrive in Turkey.
So let's conclude by getting back to relations with Russia. Mm-hmm. Let's get back to the Turkey-US-Russia triangle. What kind of a role do you think the current state of the relations between Turkey and Russia, what kind of an impact will this have on the future of Turkey-US relations?
Well, it is important that Turkey now draws this image that is more of a Russia ally than the US ally, and it has a chilling effect in Washington for many reasons. And part of it is understandable because it's a neighbor and we have, energy deals and all that, but the close exchange between Erdogan and Putin might be on the surface up to a certain point, but also it tells something about the direction that this new administration in Turkey might be willing to take in future. So obviously, neither the US nor the European Union want to see a Turkey that is more aligned with Russia than themselves for economic reasons, for military reasons, for political reasons. It would be basically swimming in dangerous waters for Turkey in the end of the day. The current administration would be forced to make a choice whether to align with Russia or with US, or how to, and it seems to be when I look at the way that relations with Russia and the US are shaping right now, it's quite confusing. There is not a clear direction. I mean, there is not a clear policy. There are, yes, statements being made, but you also have other realities on the ground that you have to deal with. So there is clearly a terrible confusion. And what comes out of the US, I have to underline that the Brunson case has to do with the US Constitution. I mean, it has an equivalence in the street, that issue. It speaks to people. Pence is from the evangelical church, and he's a very pious person. And Brunson is a pastor of the same church. And Pence, in the end of the day, or the senators in the Congress, have to report to their electorate. They have to return their wishes. So that's why you see those statements in the highest pitch. It's the same with Trump. The fact that they're holding on to this issue will have a return in their electoral basis. That's why you see those high-pitched statements there.
Thank you very much, Şebnem Arsu, for being with us tonight and for your comments.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We'll continue with our next news video. The Turkish lira plunged on Tuesday after the central bank kept interest rates on hold despite soaring inflation.
The Turkish Central Bank announced on Tuesday that it is keeping its one-week repo rate, also known as the bank's policy rate, constant at 17.75%, bucking expectations of an increase after inflation spiked to a 14-year high in June. The decision came in a statement from the bank's Monetary Policy Committee meeting. At its fifth meeting on June 7th, the bank raised the policy rate by 1.25 percentage points from 16.50%. The Turkish lira, which has lost some 20% of its value so far this year, weakened to 4.91 against the dollar following the decision on Tuesday from 4.76 directly before. In June, consumer prices in Turkey rose 15.39% year-on-year, while the annual inflation rate was 12.15% in May and 10.85% in April. Cost factors and volatility in food prices have been the main drivers of the recent upsurge in inflation, the bank said. On the other hand, price increases have shown a generalized pattern across subsectors. Despite the milder impact of demand conditions on inflation, elevated levels of inflation and inflation expectations continue to pose risks to pricing behavior, it said, adding, accordingly, the committee assessed that it might be necessary to maintain a tight monetary stance for an extended period. The bank also said that all available instruments will be used to achieve price stability targets, adding, tight stance in monetary policy will be maintained decisively until inflation outlook displays a significant improvement. Inflation expectations, pricing behavior, the lagging impact of recent monetary policy decisions, contributions of fiscal policy to rebalancing process, and other factors affecting inflation will be closely monitored, and if needed, further monetary tightening will be delivered, the bank added.
Main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP's leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, criticized the anti-terror bill, which is being discussed in the parliament, stating that the bill aims to legalize the state of emergency rule.
In the parliamentary group meeting of his party last week, main opposition Republican People's Party CHP leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu said that the anti-terror bill, which is currently being discussed in parliament, will create a non-liability for state officials in taking important decisions, also stating that the legislative bill aims to legalize the state of emergency rule. State officials have duties. They have authority, but they have no liability. If there is an authority and duty in a state, the person who exercises this authority should have liability. When you take out the liability link from the state, then there will be no state. That is the point that we have reached, Kılıçdaroğlu said. His comments came amid Parliament's discussion of the legislative bill, which stipulates a series of amendments in laws related to security and legislative issues concerning the fight against terror on July 23rd. Issued by the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, days before the lift of the 2-year state of emergency rule, the bill aims to tackle security issues that would rise in the absence of the state of emergency. Kılıçdaroğlu and the opposition have long criticized the state of emergency rule, arguing that the ruling party has used the decrees issued under the rule to bypass the current legislation in a bid to pursue their own interests and further oppress the opposition and dissidents. While these injustices were voiced by the former Prime Minister, they have issued a draft bill to the Parliament in order to sustain these injustices. While these injustices were voiced by the former Prime Minister, they have issued a draft bill to the Parliament in order to sustain these injustices, said Kılıçdaroğlu, quoting the former Prime Minister Binali Yıldırım's words, which indicate there might be unjust regulations. In the past, we could see how many people were dismissed from where, as it had been obliged to be issued in the official gazette, and the decision wasn't made by the Cabinet of Ministers. Now we will not able to see, he said, adding, injustices could be hidden from the public. He said the appeal procedures were also taken away, stating that a person who was dismissed will not be able to file a complaint. Even though the dismissed people prove their rights with evidences, there will be no guarantee that they will return to their jobs. They will be appointed to some other institutions, Kılıçdaroğlu said.
The inner disputes of the main opposition CHP and Good Party continued this week.
Weekend party meeting, Good Party's chairwoman Meral Akşener announced last weekend her decision to step down from her party's leadership following strong criticisms over her performance in the June 24th presidential elections. She had announced to convene an extraordinary convention in August, stressing that she won't run for leadership. "My decision not to be nominated as chair in the next convention is firm," Akşener said on her Twitter account on July 25th. Good Party needs to continue under a new management. However, prominent politicians of the party said the only candidate they support for leadership would be Akşener, suggesting that she will be presented as their nominee with signatures from every party member. Dozens of party members have pressed Akşener on changing her mind, while several of them have pitched tents in front of her house in Ankara to show support. On the other hand, the struggle for CHP's chair is still ongoing between the current chairman, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and the party's former presidential candidate, Muharrem İnce. Muharrem İnce supporters, who had started to collect signatures from the party's delegates in the past week, are suggesting that they have achieved the needed number of signatures to bring the party to the extraordinary congress. As of now, enough signatures have been collected for an extraordinary congress. We will continue to collect signatures until 5 p.m. on Monday, July 30th, which is the official deadline for collecting signatures, Bilecik lawmaker Yaşar Tüzün posted on his official Twitter account on late July 24th. Tüzün also added that the number of signatures exceeded 634, which is over half of the 1,200 delegates. However, CHP leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and the party administration posted calls stating the top party bodies would call for an extraordinary congress for a leadership change. They criticized the dissidents, arguing that the opposition party's primary concern should be the upcoming local elections, which would be held in March 2019, and in-house discussions over leadership change harms the preparation process. Meanwhile, 21 country commissioners of the CHP started a petition to show support for the Kılıçdaroğlu administration. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu also stated that there would be a reshuffle in the party's executive bodies. There will be a serious change in the party in the new period, he said, following his party's parliamentary group meeting. "We have given all kinds of struggles to bring democracy to this country. We continue to do so. For this reason, there will be changes. No one should question that," Kılıçdaroğlu said.
U.S. congressional defense lawmakers officially barred the delivery of the F-35 fighter jets to Turkey this week.
After Lockheed Martin's ceremony to deliver the fifth generation F-35 Joint Strike Fighter jets to the Turkish forces, the U.S. congressional defense lawmakers officially barred the delivery. According to the defense lawmakers, the legislation that was adopted by the House and Senate representatives prohibits the shipments of the jets to Ankara until the Pentagon delivers an assessment of a significant change in Turkish participation in the F-35 program, including the potential elimination of such participation. A top US State Department official told the reporters on Tuesday that the sale of the jets will be jeopardized if Turkey doesn't drop its plan to buy S-400 missile defense systems from Russia. In his testimony, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs Wes Mitchell told the Senate that if Turkey were to proceed with the S-400 purchase, it will be subject to the sanctions under the CAA-TSA sanctions law. We've also been very clear that across the board, an acquisition of S-400 will inevitably affect the prospects for Turkish military industrial cooperation with the United States, including F-35, Mitchell said. Yet Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stated that there are no problems regarding the delivery of the jets. Erdogan told the reporters that we've made a 900 million payment and the delivery of 2 of them was made to us there. Our pilots are now conducting their training flights. We don't have any concerns at this point. The first F-35 jets to be delivered to Turkey was sent to Arizona last week for military training. The jets were expected to be sent to Ankara early next year. The legislation was accepted only hours before the outbreak of the Pastor Brunson crisis between Ankara and Washington.
Turkey has told American officials this week that it opposes U.S. sanctions on Iran and that it's not obliged to implement them.
Turkey has told American officials this week that it opposes US sanctions on Iran and that it is not obliged to implement them. Speaking at a news conference in Azerbaijan, Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said, "We don't have to adhere to the sanctions imposed on a country by another country. We don't find the sanctions right either." Turkish and American officials met last week to discuss US sanctions that will begin coming into force on August 4th, after Washington withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal. Çavuşoğlu said that they had openly stated their stance to the Americans. Turkey gets oil and gas from Azerbaijan, Iran, Russia and Iraq. If I don't buy from Iran now, where am I supposed to meet that need from? He said. Turkey gets more than half of its crude oil from Iran. Washington asks allies to cut imports of Iranian oil by November and says no to any waivers for countries trading with Iran, which puts it on a collision course with Ankara.
Turkish-German football player Mesut Özil quit the German national football team this week over his decision to pose for a picture with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Fielder Mesut Özil, a German football player of Turkish descent, has effectively closed the door on international football, citing criticism from the media and the German Football Federation president that struck him as racist. In 3 hard-hitting statements on Twitter, Özil announced he was leaving the German national team on Sunday, saying he felt unwanted and would no longer be a scapegoat for Reinhard Grindel, the head of the German Football Federation. He also decided the double standards in German media and society, who are quick to point out his Turkish heritage. In the eyes of Grindel and his supporters, I am German when we win, but I am an immigrant when we lose, he said. Özil says he received criticism from the German media after meeting Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in May in London, alongside his Germany teammate Manchester City's İlkay Gündoğan, who is also of Turkish descent, and Turkey's Cenk Tosun, who plays for Premier League club Everton. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan slammed the mistreatment of Özil, saying he spoke with him on the phone. This statement by Özil and the stance he has taken is completely national and native. It is well beyond all appreciation. I congratulate him because such a racist approach due to his religion toward a young person who gave everything for the German national team, contributing to its successes, was completely unacceptable, Erdogan said. Özil's explosive statement was applauded also by Turkish ministers on Monday. I congratulate Mesut Özil, who by leaving the national team has scored the most beautiful goal against the virus of fascism, tweeted Turkish Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül. We sincerely support the honorable stance that our brother Mesut Özil has taken, tweeted Sports Minister Mehmet Kasapoğlu. İbrahim Kalın, advisor and spokesperson for the Turkish president, said Özil had given a perfectly reasonable explanation for meeting Erdogan, going on to call it a pity for those who claim to be tolerant and multiculturalist that he had felt compelled to make the statement in the first place.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Turkey next week.
Sağda Jazz Festival is gathering local and international artists this weekend, and it's an event not to be missed. Sağda is the 3rd largest island of Turkey, famous for its wine mills and vineyards, beautiful houses, historical monuments from different periods, and attractive beaches with crystal clear waters. This weekend, the Sağda Jazz Festival will celebrate its 2nd year with a huge lineup consisting of Alp Ersönmez and Erik Trufa, Ceylan Ertem, Deniz Mahir Kartal and Sarp Maden, Korhan Futacı, Emir Ersoy, Kaan Düzarat, and Analog Kültür. The Istanbul Modern Photography Gallery, which temporarily continues its activities in the Beyoğlu district of Istanbul, is currently hosting the exhibition Points of View. The exhibition brings together works by 6 artists from different generations. This selection of 25 works from the Istanbul Modern Photography collection features exploratory works in the field of photography from the 1960s onward.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.